We have now released issue 3 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine. Download it for free at newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the future evolution of human nature. This is the first in a 3-part series with Michael Murphy, the founder of the Esalen Institute and author of numerous books, including Jacob Adabet, Golf in the Kingdom, The End of Ordinary History, and The Future of the Body, Explorations into the Further Evolution of Human Nature. Welcome, Michael.
Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, for several decades now, you have been researching world literature to look at extraordinary experiences that occur in dozens and dozens of different fields. And you seem to be suggesting that if we look at these extraordinary things that are unbelievable to many people in mainstream culture, that we can get glimmerings of what the future holds for human nature and for humanity.
That's right. What's impressive about the study of the extraordinary in human nature is you find it arising in all cultures, East and West, North and South, among men and women, young and old. Mm-hmm. Yes, we've been collecting this data for about 15 years, and it grows out of my interest in these things, what helped behind my impulse to start Esalen 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you're taking almost a natural history approach, I suppose,
Yes.
kind of like Darwin, traveling all around the world and looking at unusual species.
Yes.
Only you're studying one species.
Yes, that's a good word for it. I like to call it a natural history of the extraordinary. Mm-hmm. You can date this approach really to the 1880s. Frederick Myers, one of the principal founders of modern psychical research, invented the word telepathy. William James in The Varieties of Religious Experience, Abraham Maslow's work, studying peak experience, Margarita Lasky's great work. This has been for for more than a century. This approach has been developing, and so I see our project very much in that tradition.
Mm-hmm. Now, it would be useful, I think, for our viewers to know that you yourself have also been a student and a practitioner of different transformative disciplines.
Yes, I spent a year and a half at Aurobindo's ashram in the 1950s, and yes, I practiced meditation and Aurobindo's integral yoga and distance running. We used to call it, used to be called seniors running. We now call it masters running, and other disciplines. So I've had exposure to these disciplines, which has given me more sympathy to approach this material.
Let's focus on Aurobindo for a bit. He's been one of your biggest influences and certainly one of the great spiritual masters of India, who wrote distinctly about the transformative powers of yoga practice on the human body itself.
Yes. This study, when you begin to take seriously the possibility that the extraordinary is arising in all cultures, and you get into the study, as we have done, you find that many of these capacities are evident in physical movement, and in sport, in shamanism, in the various physical yogas. In fact, in all the great contemplative shamanic traditions, there is a huge physical component. Aurobindo helped to dramatize the idea that we do not know the limits of bodily transformation. And if you start to look at the lore of bodily transformation, it gets very, very interesting. It exists in every tradition.
And in India, I think, is an excellent tradition to begin to focus on, because for thousands of years they've maintained a detailed literature, a very disciplined philosophical approach that enumerated to a high degree the specific kinds of changes that practitioners of yoga and meditation went through.
Yes. In Hatha Yoga, you see this tremendous mastery of the autonomic nervous system. Anything that can be brought to awareness can be mastered. Interestingly enough, the more I've gotten immersed in this kind of material, I've been drawn to the Roman Catholic tradition, because no other religious tradition has made such an effort to winnow out fact from fancy in the canonization proceedings of the Church, which are run like giant law trials, in which all witnesses are put under oath. And particularly for Catholic witnesses, and these nuns and these monks who observe these things and have lived with the saint involved, it is a mortal sin to lie to the promotor fide, the devil's advocate. So what has built up over the last 600 or 700 years is a huge body of data regarding the extraordinary phenomena of the contemplative life, and including these physical phenomena. So I've drawn very heavily in my own research on that Roman Catholic data.
You think it's more reliable than the traditions that have been handed down from India?
Well, it's not necessarily more reliable, but there has been a more thorough documentation of particular instances. So if you want to quote the testimony about the life of St. Teresa of Avila, you have all these nuns who observed her over the course of her life, who told in intimate detail stories about her ecstasies. There is even testimony about her apparent levitations. She said she levitated. I'm agnostic about this. Nevertheless, there's that sort of data. So it's unique. It's a unique resource.
Levitation would be one of the really extreme claims that
exactly.
one finds in this literature, and I suppose it's interesting to note that it's found in many different cultures.
Yes, it is. Now in this, my recent book, The Future of the Body, it was a big debate I had with my publisher about whether or not to include levitation. I remain agnostic about whether or not it's ever actually happened, but the quality of the testimony of these nuns who claim to have seen her levitate, or who have seen St. Joseph of Cupertino, is interesting in and of itself, not only for the wealth of testimony, but the vivid details of it, the grotesque, sometimes grotesque phenomena that seem to accompany this thing. And you wonder why this testimony is there. It looks like a kind of anthropology that is being done. But in any case, the Roman Catholic data is very rich, very detailed, quite disciplined, and it corresponds beautifully in many respects to what we have from the Eastern traditions.
Well, it strikes me, Michael, that the kernel of your work is that you've developed a taxonomy based on looking at the natural world. You've looked at, over the course of billions of years of evolution, what are the capacities that animals have developed, and then how in human culture have we been able to further refine those capacities, and then how, if we look at the extraordinary events, they are refined even further. And you start with some very simple things, not necessarily levitation at all.
Well, the more I've been immersed in this data, the more it has borne in upon me that all human attributes give rise to the extraordinary. And no matter how you divide up the mind-body complex to describe it, each part gives rise to the metanormal, to the extraordinary. Now, in the Future of the Body, I chose 12 sets of human attributes: perception, kinesthesis, cognition, vitality, etc. And each of these, across cultures, gives rise to extraordinary versions of themselves. So this is the case, and all of these human attributes, which arose out of animal nature in the course of evolution, give rise to the extraordinary. So it does give us another look at our evolutionary possibilities. Not evolution that would be passed on genetically, of course. I mean, I don't come out a neo-Lamarckian, but capacities that would be passed on through education, through transformative practices.
You referred to Lamarck a moment ago, and I think for the benefit of our viewers, we ought to define what you mean when you say you're not a neo-Lamarckian.
Well, the Lamarckian theory that if I get big muscles, my kids are going to tend to have big muscles. I mean, this is not the way it works. Our genes are relatively impervious, perhaps completely impervious to, the changes we make in a lifetime. There's a great random effect, apparently, in our offspring in terms of the qualities that come up. And natural selection in animal evolution and differential reproduction has been the mechanisms. But in human development and in the development of cultures, you have it's passed along through institutions, through education, and so forth. So,
I think one of the interesting examples that you've chosen is something very basic. It's love. It's not necessarily extraordinary, but you point out if we look at evolution, it took quite a while before you got creatures who were soft and furry and cuddly and cared for their young in a loving way.
Yes, well, love is developing all the while on the face of the earth, and it can develop in us. And you could make a case that love is always extraordinary and always has the germ of this unitive awareness that I like to think of as an extraordinary type of cognition, an extraordinary way of knowing, this sense of unity between you and me that is right at the heart of love. But there are these very dramatic forms of love and that appear between lovers or in saints and mystics that bring with it an extraordinary range of phenomena, and that's interesting too. I think that one of the interesting things that emerges is if you look at human nature in its complexity, and as I said, I chose these 12 sets of attributes, you find that the development of a particular capacity, let's say extraordinary movement abilities among athletes, tend to give rise to extraordinary perceptual abilities or extraordinary cognitive capacities. And conversely, if somebody develops extraordinary cognition, say through contemplative prayer or through meditation, very often, spontaneously, these tremendous physical capacities arise. I've been influenced a lot by Herbert Thurston, who was a great student of the physical phenomena of Roman Catholic mysticism, probably the greatest authority on such phenomena in the 20th century.
He was a priest, was he not?
Yes, he was a Jesuit, and he British, and he a great classic work, The Physical Phenomena of Mysticism. And he culled through these canonization proceedings. He really has alerted me to the richness of the Roman Catholic tradition. But he shows these extraordinary movement ability. There was something called ecstatic walking. One of the charisms. The charisms in the Roman Catholic tradition are, for all practical purposes, the same as the siddhis in the Hindu Buddhist.
Which are the great powers that are obtained through yogic practice.
Yes, as byproducts of yogic practice, these siddhis emerge. Even if they're not sought, they arise. The same with the charisms in the Roman Catholic Church. So why is it that in the practice of contemplative prayer, this ecstatic walking, these something called bodily elongations, this was noted, this hyperflexibility. St. Teresa, for example, would get into these extraordinary postures in her ecstasies that seemed anatomically impossible. There's a record of this going back 600 or 700 years. In other words, one extraordinary attribute tends to give rise to another. Now, conversely, among athletes who have no psychology or philosophy to support this sort of thing, nevertheless, achieving these great physical abilities, suddenly have these illumined perceptions, these extraordinary knowings, kinds of religious experiences, typically have a hard time talking to their coaches and teammates about it. But I've been interviewing athletes now for 20 years, and this research project that we've had going on exceptional functioning, the Esalen Institute project on exceptional functioning, we've interviewed hundreds of athletes now and have built up quite a body of data here. So the same thing at work again. One extraordinary attribute tends to give rise to others in our nature.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Since these phenomena are reported by people from almost every culture and almost every walk of life, I think you wrote at one point that when you talk to people, it's hard to find anybody who hasn't experienced something quite extraordinary in their lifetime. Yet at the same time, there's this, especially in mainstream academia, a kind of a shroud of silence that covers it all. These things are not to be discussed.
Well, every culture selects out certain of our human potentialities to reinforce, others are neglected, and others are actively suppressed. In modern culture, there's not a high premium put on the contemplative life, and these paranormal abilities are not highly regarded or even believed in by mainstream scientists and academic philosophers for the most part. There's a tremendous prejudice in modern academia against this aspect of human functioning. Many scientists and academic philosophers deny that telepathy or clairvoyance or spiritual healing even happens. Nevertheless, you have this huge body of data produced by modern psychical research and parapsychology. You have the enduring testimony of every religious tradition, and now, over the last 20 years, you have the Gallup poll, the National Opinions Research Council polls, many polls, which show that 2/3 or more of the American public believe that they have had these experiences. I've come to believe that all of these metanormal or extraordinary capacities are glimmering in all of us. And I call them metanormalities of everyday life. It's kind of a play on Freud's psychopathology of everyday life.
Yeah.
That, you know, how many of us have had this extrasensory intuition that somebody is watching us, and you turn around and you see somebody, or driving along a freeway and, you know, pulling over just 30 seconds before a highway patrolman appears, or sensing that a phone call is going to come to you from a friend and a minute later it comes. This kind of, I mean, we could go on naming these. I developed an inventory actually of more than 1,000 of these metanormalities of everyday life, and in The Future of the Body, this recent book of mine, I only listed 100. But if in every human attribute, again, you can find these kind of glimmerings of the extraordinary in everyday life.
They're glimmering everywhere, and that's my experience too.
Exactly.
And yet I find that almost everywhere, except perhaps on discussions such as this, there's an effort to suppress it. Even within the spiritual and religious traditions, these things are not to be talked about and are considered traps and impediments towards real spiritual growth.
I know. You've got, first you have the practical requirements of life, you know, where, and we are creatures of habit. We have our first tasks of the day, and many of these possibilities are just left neglected because of practical considerations. Then on top of that, you have cultural biases against some of them, and finally, you have religious biases also. And I think that it's time now in human history to reappraise the human potential. Well, we have an opportunity, such as humankind never had before, to take survey of human potentialities. You see, medical science had never given us as much knowledge as we have today about how the body changes through meditation, through fitness training, through biofeedback, etc. We've never had the Upanishads available in multiple translations at the corner drugstore. We have all this new anthropology of shamanism. We have psychical research. So we have all this evidence for the metanormal. But the problem is we have this huge information explosion. We have the specialization of modern academic life. We have this scientific fundamentalism, which says that telepathy, clairvoyance doesn't happen. You have many religious fundamentalisms that deny this. You have many New Age fundamentalisms that say that, for example, in certain circles, that the body is somehow, you know, to be left behind in some ascent to nirvana. So you have a lot of competing belief systems. So for all these reasons, it's difficult to bring this knowledge into a purview.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we have an unprecedented opportunity. And so that's the idea driving my research.
One of the things that you point out is that not only have these phenomena been noticed for thousands of years, but actually if we look at the tradition of philosophy, philosophers have engaged in examination of these things for just as long a time.
Well, I quote this wonderful British philosopher, C.D. Broad, who says, if we judge philosophy by what the greatest philosophers have done, we find that they include all this material in their purview of human nature. Going back to Plato, who talked about noesis, or the contemplative insight, which was something beyond discursive reason, dianoia. We find it and talked about occult connections between us all and the gods, between invisible entities. And this is in Plato, right at the beginning of our tradition. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest Catholic theologians, and into modern times, Bergson, Schopenhauer, who loved the Upanishads. And then in the East, it's been fundamental to all Eastern philosophy. So East and West, the greatest thinkers have said, yes, we have to look at the whole range of the human potential.
One of the things that has puzzled me about your writing and thinking in this area is that you suggest that some philosophical concepts have suppressed discussion, and you choose as an example of that Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, or the Superman, which almost would seem to me just the opposite. As if
no. What I was saying there is it's the reaction to his it's the reaction against, and then the misappropriation of the Übermensch by Nazi spokesmen that has vaccinated, as it were, a lot of people against thinking about radical self-exceeding. It's not not Nietzsche's thinking itself. Nietzsche was a bold pioneer of this, but it's this reaction. The minute you begin to talk about the metanormal, it calls up the fear, of some sort of Nazi Superman.
Yeah.
But that's why in The Future of the Body I took pains to say that the extraordinary, if we look at it in its full emergence in human nature, gives rise to these ego-surpassing forms of love and well-being, and make us better able to serve our fellows. And it's not necessarily leading to some ego-bound Superman.
I see. So your goal in doing this research and bringing together all of this evidence is in some sense, I gather, to assemble a model of what we could become.
Yes, it's descriptive. The research is descriptive, but it is also normative in a sense, because I think when you look at all of these potentialities, yes, you see a frontier there.
There's one other puzzling and for me somewhat troubling aspect of the history that I'd like to go into,
Yeah.
and you cite the extensive literature within the Christian tradition for the physical resurrection of the body.
Yes.
What do you make of that?
Well, I argue that these tremendous possibilities, these potentialities, have been foreshadowed in legend and in myth. And I chose the Christian doctrine of the glorified body because it has fascinated the greatest Christian thinkers since St. Paul, in spite of its manifest absurdity, that at the final day we're all going to get our body back in the assumption into the final days. Well, here were all these leading thinkers. What our body at what age? What about children who die, etc. So if you say, why did they stick with this thing?
Yes.
In spite of the blatant superstition of it, if you reinterpret it to say this is some deep intuition. So I've invited my readers in The Future of the Body to read from St. Thomas Aquinas, from Origen, the great theologian of Greek antiquity, and Romano Guardini, the 20th century Roman Catholic theologian. If you read their works as a grand thought experiment about bodily transformation, it's extraordinarily interesting. In this respect, I would say a lot of the myths and legends that have arisen out of the mystical tradition are like modern fantasy literature, science fiction, even children's cartoons, where all of these metanormal attributes are foreshadowed. You know, you can take all 12 sets of attributes, for example, that I explored in the Future of the Body, and find examples. Obi-Wan Kenobi, you know, in Star Wars, his telepathic sensitivity to distant events, the kind of luminous embodiment of the figures in Cocoon, and Paddy Chayefsky's Altered States, the protagonist's return through this deep kinesthesis back into his own cells, back in time. And you find these intuitions. See, the human race always, Marshall McLuhan once remarked that if you look at an artist as the distant early warning system for the human race, here are these intuitions out there. And this natural history approach, as you can say, is kind of like the infantry coming up, you know, behind these scouts. So
it's interesting, and one of the other, we only have a couple minutes left, Mike, but I do want to touch on one of the points you draw upon, which is that every tradition, every culture has its own legends, its own thinking about post-mortem survival, and that it seems to suggest the same kind of intuition about the body, that if nothing else, it's larger than just these three dimensions that we experience with our senses.
That's right. Again, there is a tremendous lore in all traditions about post-mortem survival. Now, even if you remain agnostic about what's going on the other side, which I remain agnostic, because after all, there have been at least 4 major different theories held by the greatest mystics and philosophers. You know, reincarnation is one, the typical Western view of one life only, some Buddhist mystics who say there's nothing after this, or then some Taoists, Gurdjieff, some Hawaiian kahunas have said only a few survive and not others. So we have at least those 4 giant theories. But nevertheless, you have an enormous lore about post-mortem survival. And if you look at it, there's a lore corresponding to all 12 of these attributes that, you know, I've mentioned, that they all go on. So you could conceive that some sort of journey of a spirit body, a post-mortem survival, a kind of spirit body that would continue the adventure of psychosomatic transformation beyond the grave. It's conceivable.
Or perhaps in modern terms, something like a hyperspace body.
Yes, exactly.
Michael Murphy, it's been a pleasure sharing this half hour with you.
Well, it's wonderful to be here.
Thanks so much for being with me.
Wonderful to be here.
And thank you for being with us for part 1 of a 3-part series. Tune in again for parts 2 and 3. I imagine that by now many of you already realize that, in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the new Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death? New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.